Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Conversations Over Coffee. This session is being recorded, and then we're going to send it to Facebook for whatever reason. For the first time in weeks since we've been doing this, we had an issue going from Zoom to the Facebook live stream. We're sorry about that. We'll check into that and make sure for next week that we've had all the glitches put out. But in the meantime, we are here. And hopefully you'll be watching this a little bit delayed, but I hope you'll enjoy it and find it as meaningful as I know that I will. I'm Steve Wernick, Rabbi Wernick, one of the rabbis at Beth Tzedec congregation in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And this is Conversations Over Coffee, a weekly 30-minute Zoom side chat with interesting people, really designed to talk about current events and the state of our world. It started, of course, coming out of COVID and the pandemic, but now the world continues to throw curveballs at us. So we have to continue to catch them and do our best to find meaning. My guest this morning is Andre Ivory. Hi, Andre, welcome. Andre is a dynamic Jewish educator with over 20 years of dedicated service to the community. He specializes in programming for youth. He served congregations in his hometown of Los Angeles, California, and Toronto, Ontario, where he lived for 7 years attending York University, spent summers at Camp Vermont in Canada, and served as the youth director at Beth Tzedec congregation from 2007 to 2011. That's why Andre might be familiar to a lot of you Beth Tzedec people. Though 2011 is 9 years ago, almost a decade, Andre, when your name is mentioned, it's like people go, oh, Andre, it's like you're the beloved youth director here. And that time, those 4 years, you clearly had a huge impact on this community, on many, many young people and their families. Andre moved to Phoenix in 2011 and has dedicated his service to synagogues in the Jewish community and Jewish community organizations across Arizona. One of the things that you know about Andre, as I learned this morning, is that he's been in Phoenix long enough where he says, oh, today it's only 105 degrees. But it's a dry heat.
Yeah, it's a dry heat.
And that's at 9:30 in the morning, you said, right?
Yes.
Yeah, well, drink lots of water.
Preferred. Iced
coffee, lots of water. So Andre, I'm going to begin with the question that I know that I really shouldn't ask, and I'm going to talk about why I shouldn't ask it, because the question is, tell us about your journey. Now, normally, if I were to ask that to anybody else, it wouldn't be a big deal because we all have journeys. But when you ask that question, I've learned to a Jewish person of color, the insinuation is, well, you couldn't have been born Jewish, and you can't really be Jewish. So tell me your journey so I can check your tzitzis and make sure you're Jewish. So I asked the question both as a demonstration of, these questions are, questions that might seem innocuous or really loaded questions when asked to certain people. But at the same time, you have a fascinating journey, and I think people can be interested in it and will learn from it. So I ask you to respond to that question in whatever way you feel comfortable.
No, I think I do get the question a lot. I get when I first started my college education, I was a student at what was then the University of Judaism, is now the American Jewish University. And a joke was made to me one day, and in today's context, this joke is taken a little bit differently, that because our classes were so small, I could never be absent from class. It's because that I would always be noticed that I would be absent from class. But people have grown over the years to feel more comfortable at asking me this question, and I've become more comfortable in answering it. I firmly believe that everyone has a unique journey to this point where we are speaking face to face, even though digitally today, at this time. And my story, yes, has its unique characteristics, and a lot of it doesn't have anything to do with ethnicity or socioeconomic background, which certainly were things that certainly make my journey a bit different. I grew up in LA, in a certain part of LA that wasn't always the best part of LA, even to today. That was um, um, that had its criminal elements, certainly had its gang influences. But I was blessed to be raised by two parents, both of whom um, originated from a segregated South, my mother being from Texas and Oklahoma, and my father from Tennessee, who were really um, encouraging all five of their children to explore the world around them, to not be limited by your socioeconomic status, by your skin color, by your intelligence level. Explore the world. I was a kid who took that to heart and started playing hockey at the age of 7 years old, and it's still an incredible part of my life. When I was a teenager, I was influenced by a lot of my friends who were involved in various different things. Some of them were involved in gangs, and I became curious about joining a gang when I was a teenager, and ultimately had a friend who was a very close friend who was murdered because of his gang involvement. And that same person who murdered my friend tried to kill me. And when you have those moments in life, you start to think about what my father used to call your foundations. What are the foundation? My father worked in construction, so he spoke about everything in terms of building things. And he says, if you don't have a strong foundation in your life, the house, whatever you build on top of it, is going to fall over. And so I started exploring what was the foundation of my life. And as a 16-year-old, I started becoming more curious about the religion that my family was part of, which was Lutheran. My family belonged to a Lutheran church, and my parents were very active in that church. Even though on Sunday mornings you were more likely to find me at a hockey rink than you were in a church pew. And
I just want to say that it's very clear how you ended up in Toronto.
yes,
Right. To get into hockey in LA
yes,
is a challenge.
and I ended up in Canada first through Ramah in Canada by being invited to camp as a hockey instructor, as someone who would teach kids hockey. And you wonder, how more strange that you think they could find somebody in Toronto to teach Jewish kids about hockey, but they had to search to California in order to find it. But I'm thankful that the journey took me there. And that in itself really is an example of where my journey ended up. I had a wonderful teacher in high school who taught a comparative religions course, and he fed my curiosity. And the more and more I studied about Judaism, as well as other religions, Judaism in particular just sparked me. And the more I learned, the more questions I had. And I scoured the city to speak to every rabbi I could in Los Angeles about Judaism. And at the age of 17, I decided, what a great foundation. So I decided to start the conversion process at the age of 17 and a half years old. I studied for 2.5 years, had my Beit Din and mikveh at 20 years old. And less than a month later, I started as a freshman at the University of Judaism as a Jewish studies major, and haven't looked back since. A year later, I end up at Ramah.
What year did you start at the UJ?
1999, August of 1990.
Yeah, so you're younger than I am. I was at the UJ from 90 to 92.
Yeah.
And I started rabbinical school there, thinking that I didn't want to be in New York longer than I had to be. So we miss each other by a couple of years.
Yeah, and probably we had some of the same fascinating instructors who sparked our curiosity and fueled our love for Judaism. And it just kept rolling from there, and 5 years later, I end up, in living in Toronto and transferring to York University. And then a couple of years after that, I end up at Beth Tzedec, where I still to this day say, I've spent probably the best 4 years of my life, there and growing with the community and learning from the community. I probably learned more from the community there than I taught them. And then, of course, it's launched me into my involvement in the community here in Phoenix. So, it really does come down. My life is really built on that solid foundation. Judaism is my solid foundation, and a lot of how I see the world today is built. It comes from that viewpoint. It comes from standing on top of that foundation.
Are your parents still with us?
My dad is not. My dad passed away when I was 13 years old, which was one of the reasons why I kept his sayings in my mind. And my mother lives here in Phoenix, and she still teaches me and still scolds me every now and then when I do things wrong, as mothers have the right to do. But I still learn from her, and she is still a churchgoer, and we have the most wonderful conversations about religion and God and the world. And of course, even today, what the circumstances where my mother was one of 5 Black kids to graduate from her high school class at a parochial school in Oklahoma City, and the only Black woman to graduate from her class, and a participant in the civil rights movement. And actually, in 2011, during a trip with a lot of Toronto teens called the Paperclips trip, my mother spoke to a lot of what were then teens, now young adults, who are part of our community, about her experiences, and I've learned a lot from her about perspectives on how to look at what's going on in the world today.
So I want to emphasize that this conversation is really like a fireside chat or a Zoom side chat. Andre speaks from his personal experience and from the prism of the Jewish values that have been part of his life now for quite a time, but does not speak from the perspective of a professional who responds to hate and racism and so forth. So I just want to, for transparency's sake, we're having a conversation amongst 2 people. We're not taking it from from a professional perspective, but I think that the personal experience in some ways is more important than the professional experience. And I was wondering if you'd share with us, what have been your observations? What are you thinking? What are you feeling as a result of all the turmoil that we've been experiencing, certainly in the United States, but it has awoken, I think, these dormant sense of systemic injustices in many, many countries, including Canada.
Mm-hmm.
But as from your perspective, how do you understand what's going on today?
I'm thankful that you prefaced this with that announcement that I'm not a professional at this. One, because the last thing I think I need, and for sure neither one of us need, is another title behind our names and another responsibility to carry. And 2, I'm just one man trying to make sense of all of this, and trying to navigate my way through it. It has been a very strange time, because I think what it has prompted in our current situation, with following the murder of George Floyd, or even from my childhood experience following the beating of Rodney King and the acquittal of the 4 officers, I think it has awoken a conversation about who we are as a society, what are our responsibilities, to people as a society. But I think even more from my own personal experience, and these are the conversations that I've really had. What are our responsibilities to one another? What do we owe each other as human beings? I've lost a little bit of sleep over these issues, and what's keeping me up is a concept that I really learned from my parents, particularly my mother, and her participation in the civil rights movement, and my own experiences. Look, as a teenager, being one of few Black kids who played hockey, I got it all the time on the ice. I get it even from the Jewish community. I get the question all the time, how can you be Black and Jewish? It's like a double negative. What do you want to be persecuted your whole life? I've never seen myself as a victim. I have had experiences where people have tried to put me in that light of being less than, of being something, being an other. What I've tried to do in my conversations is really lean on my foundation of Judaism and try to treat people, really awaken that concept within myself of treating people as they are creations of God. I've become even more spiritually connected because of this. One, because I pray that people understand the intrinsic, the innate godly value of every other individual, but also that I understand that I see it within myself, that I understand. I think that's probably one of the greatest conversations, is how Black people view themselves, that they have to matter to themselves, and see themselves as a valuable part and a contributing part of society. There's a lot of different thoughts, and some of them are uneasy and should be uneasy conversations to have with ourselves and to have with others.
What are some of the other ways that the Jewish community perhaps falls down when it comes to communicating and welcoming and engaging members of its community that are different than what we assume to be normative? So what are some of the other ways in which you've experienced that, and do you know that other people perhaps have experienced that?
I was once in I won't name the place out of respect for the work that this place does, but I was once not counted in a minyan because they couldn't verify the halachic, quote unquote, halachic nature of my conversion. And that hurt. That hurt because I knew what that meant. I've often been, I've often been confused for being Ethiopian. I've often been thought of or mistaken for somebody else who is a Jew of color, because we all look the same, apparently. I think one of the ways that the Jewish community, and this has been an ongoing struggle for the Jewish community for a while, we don't acknowledge the diversity of our community enough. We tend to see the Jewish community through Ashkenazi eyes and don't realize that there is a spectrum, there's a rainbow of different practices, different backgrounds that already exists, that has existed for thousands of years, and we have not celebrated it enough. And then, of course, you put in, whether it be Jews of color or Jews by choice, we have to celebrate our own diversity. And I think we have to begin by an education of that not everything comes from a basis of kugel and, and rugelach and, and not, or as a friend of mine said to me the other day, that not all of our Seder plates look the same. That our journeys come from different places, but yet when we talk about being gathered from all four corners of the earth, when we say the Shema, that means that Jews are coming from every perspective, every place on the planet, and they bring unique experiences. We have to teach this. We have to teach our diversity, and that under the tent, we're all here for the same purpose. We're all here to celebrate the one God.
What are some of the ways that you would, as a Jewish educator, what are some of the ways in which you are teaching that, and the recommendations that you would have for others to be teaching that as well?
I call myself a walking education piece. Every time I walk into a room, I don't see myself as, as an other. I don't see myself as an other. I want people to see that I'm participating in the same joyous, religious or cultural experience that they are. But also at the same time, I'm not afraid to teach my different perspectives. When I talk about, I always teach on Martin Luther King Day. I always teach on Martin Luther King Day. And I teach from a perspective of how Dr. King, his vision of the world is actually a very Jewish vision of the world. I also would introduce people and have in the past introduced people to various different traditions that they may not be familiar with, and explaining their meaning. When I first moved to Toronto, I was living in a basement apartment of a wonderful family that has an Iraqi-Israeli background. And I became curious about different practices that brought about the same meaning, and not being afraid to incorporate some of those things. They come from a different place, but not being afraid to incorporate some of those things into our own practice. That it's Judaism from a different part of the world, but expresses the same meaning in the end. It's really about exposure.
What are some of the difficult conversations you think that the Jewish community needs to have with regard to this issue? You really, well, let me rephrase it. It's like, if the Jewish community were really to make that shift and to start taking the diversity of the community more seriously, what would be the priorities from your experience? What would be the priorities that you think the Jewish community would need to examine?
I think one of the main priority comes from Rabbi Heschel, actually, in the key thing. I've been talking about this really a lot over the last couple of weeks. Comes from Rabbi Heschel, and this is a speech that sparked his friendship with Dr. King, that we have to come to grips with moving B'Tselem Elohim from an idea to an actual practice. And that means that we can see ethnicity, but we can see difference, but ultimately in the end, we are all the creation of God. And to subdivide, this is Rabbi Heschel's words, to subdivide God's creation is to ignore God's creation and to defile God's creation. That's step number one. Step number two is to understand that not all Jews of color and not all people of color are victims or are helpless. We need to celebrate their accomplishments and their differences. We need to celebrate our own differences and not be afraid of our own differences. As a Black kid, I had a lesson. My father told me, this was in 2nd grade, a kid in school called me the N-word. 2nd grade. I'm not going to necessarily blame. I was distraught. It was really my first ever experience with that word, and it was an incredible teaching moment. And it's something that I think a lot of Black people experience. My father pulled me aside and he said, I was in tears coming home. I couldn't believe. I didn't understand it. And my father said, no matter what, you are to be celebrated. Hold your head up high. Don't lean over. Don't bend over to somebody. Don't bow your head because somebody called you a name. You are worthy of being celebrated. I think sometimes as a Jewish community, we sometimes sit around waiting to be victims of something instead of being proud of who we are and celebrating and allowing the rest of the world to celebrate who we are. I would stick really to those two principles, the first one being the primary one. Rabbi Heschel, and that speech, Dr. King, after Heschel just gave that speech, Dr. King walked across the room to introduce himself because he saw the world that way too. As a man who believed in God. And I think that first principle is so key. Do we see people as subdivisions? Do we see people of different ethnicities, sexual orientations as a subdivision, or do we see them all under this wonderful, beautiful, talit that is the creation of God?
It's a beautiful image.
Yeah.
The talit.
Yeah.
On the move from an idea to practice, what are some of the ways people can become better practitioners of B'Tselem Elokim?
I think it is really about quote my father again.
I was going to say, today, father is like such a profound impact, Andre. It's,
yeah, I haven't even gotten into the realm of quoting my mother yet. Yeah. My father and I had some interesting moments together. And one of the things he told me was the greatest blessing you could ever bestow on somebody is saying hello. I think we have to not be afraid to talk to each other like human beings, and let it go from there. Not be afraid to talk to someone. I was actually speaking to the middle school group at Netivot HaTorah a couple of weeks ago, and they asked me this similar question. I said, it all begins with potentially speaking to someone in your class who you've never spoken to before, who you before othered, and say, they're over there and we are over here, and I am not associated with them. It all begins with us having those simple conversations. We do have a blueprint for dealing with this craziness. We have a blueprint. And the steps of implementing this blueprint are actually very easy. I actually move away from, yes, there is some political responsibility, but at the same time, the responsibility also falls on our shoulders as individuals, to really stop othering people and bring them underneath. If we want to continue to use that talit example, bring them in, bring them underneath as a human being, and celebrate our differences from there.
I really, that image I think is really profound. The talit as the chuppah basically, and the chuppah like Abraham's tent being open on all four sides. Yeah. That everywhere you look, you see a person created b'Tselem Elohim. And to get back to that opening question, one of the reasons that I've learned recently that question is so bad is because it assumes that it makes assumptions about people as like, maybe you're there as the help, or, you work there, or a convert. And, as you said, it's that otherness, that what you have to stop is the otherness. As a member of the congregation, and actually even now a member of the board, taught me that you have to stop thinking that my curiosity is more important than the comfort of the person who's there.
Of course. And
so that's why the welcome, exactly what you said, hello, hi, welcome to Beth Tzedec, is the response, is where it starts. And so I think that's really a profound, profound message.
We say as part of our tefillah, that God loves us, and that through that love, God redeems us. We ask for redemption as connected to that love. Well, how much greater would we spread that redemptive force if we loved one another? Yes, I understand some people can, come as a comeback say, well, that's such a grandiose idea. It's so, it's so in the clouds, but it's so simple yet so meaningful. I think one thing that our world is suffering from, this is partly COVID and partly ethnic relations, is there seems to be a love deficit in the world at the moment. COVID-19 is keeping us apart in terms of physically being able to hug each other, shake each other's hands, pat each other on the back. And then now we're being divided into groups, which means we're trying to define how we love our own group and love another group. Love is the greatest redemptive power on the planet. When you show love to another person, they are forever connected to you, and you show them value beyond anything else, beyond political ramifications, beyond cultural definitions. Love is the greatest redemptive power, and I'm trying my best. Some days are better than others, to try to use more love to redeem myself and to redeem others.
So Andre, a question that was shared with me that I think is really relevant is, kol hakavod to you to have the strength to be able to do that, to see yourself as a walking educational opportunity. Not everybody has that strength and is willing to take on the responsibility of an entire community in a way perhaps that you're willing to do. What are some of the things that you think a community can do so that no one individual has to necessarily feel that they're the educational representative of that community?
Well, it comes down to how we define people. I had the pleasure of being the youth director at Beth Tzedec without feeling the pressure of having to be responsible for my entire community. I was judged, as Dr. King would say, on the content of my character, not by the color of my skin. And I think if someone is willing to pray with us in the way that we pray, we should be welcoming. If they're praying to God, to the one God, then they are part of us. I got to thinking over Shavuot about this concept, about what Ruth said. Your people are my people. Where you go, I go. Are we willing to bring, no matter what our differences are, bring people along and let them educate us, instead of saying, well, we now have a Black guy who's our youth director. No, we have someone who's qualified, who loves kids as our youth director. We have someone who is, who is indigenous as part of our, well, no, they're part of our community, and they're going to be treated as such. It comes down to, are they willing to walk with us? And if not, then we have to learn to love our enemies even more sometimes, to try to bring them along, to try to redeem them as well.
Andre, thank you so much for this conversation. It's so timely and so important. And, look, I can't agree with you more, right? That to move from idea to practice in terms of B'Tselem Elohim, and to celebrate our diversity and accomplishments as a community. Really, really good advice. I know I'm speaking for a lot of people. You are welcome here anytime. Whenever you're ready to come back for a visit, let us know. We'll be happy to welcome you, and certainly to celebrate not only the accomplishments that you had when you were here as the youth director, but also the accomplishments that you've done since then. Thank you for being here, and I hope we'll have another opportunity to continue these conversations, not only with you, but with other people. We need to have these difficult conversations, and we need to really set the stage for this shift from idea to practice. We need to be practicing what it means to really welcome people, to include people based on the divinity that all of us share, rather than the artificial separations that come to our mind, and from the cultural baggage that we all carry with us. That's it for today. I want to invite everybody next week, June 29th at 12:30 for Conversations Over Coffee. We're going to have a special next week. We're going to extend it to an hour. June 29th happens to be my birthday. And so I've invited my cousin, Paul Hirsch, who's the film editor and Academy Award winner for the movie called Star Wars. Maybe you heard of it, 1977. So my cousin Paul, who's film editor for Star Wars, was also nominated for an Academy Award for the movie Ray, and did a lot of, at least my favorite movies, over the course of the 40-some movies that he's edited in his career. Will be my guest. We're going to talk about his journey to getting to Star Wars, some of the things that went into the final cut of the film that so many of us love so much, as well as the moral underpinnings of the movie that perhaps played a role in its popularity throughout the generations. That's next week at 12:30. For everything else that's going on at Beth Tzedec, that's why we have a website, www.beth-tzedec.org. Beth Tzedec, all access. Join us often. We look forward to seeing you. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks, Andre.
Goodbye. Thank you.